The sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. The air was dry and still, the kind of silence only found in the vast stretches of the desert. Jack Turner, a cowboy in his early 30s, had been riding for hours. His horse Dusty had wandered off earlier that morning, and now Jack was determined to find him before nightfall. Jack was no stranger to the desert. He had spent most of his life riding across the open land, caring for cattle and surviving on what the land provided. But today felt different. The desert seemed quieter, the air heavier. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about the day unsettled him. Maybe it was the way the wind whispered through the tall grass, or the way the sky seemed darker than usual, even though the sun was still high. As Jack rode across the dry plains, the familiar rhythm of his horse's hooves on the ground was the only sound. He had seen the desert change over the years, from wild, untamed land to the edges of settled farms and towns. Yet there were still parts of the desert that had not been touched by men. These places, Jack knew, held their own secrets. The land ahead of him stretched out in a seemingly endless sea of sand and brush. Jack glanced up at the sky, watching a lone crow circle high above. He pulled his hat lower to shield his eyes from the harsh sunlight and kept his focus ahead. It had been a few hours since Dusty had bolted, and Jack was starting to worry. Dusty wasn't like most horses. He had been with Jack since the beginning, and the two shared a bond built over years of companionship. Losing him in the wilds of the desert would be dangerous, even for a cowboy as experienced as Jack. As he rode further, he kept his eyes on the horizon, hoping to catch a glimpse of Dusty. His thoughts drifted to the day's events. It had started like any other, a simple morning of feeding the cattle and checking the fences. But Dusty had spooked for no reason Jack could see, running off into the hills without any warning. It was unlike him, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The wind began to pick up, stirring the dust along the ground. Jack pulled his horse to a stop and listened. In the distance, he thought he heard something, a faint rustling, a sound that didn't belong in the otherwise quiet desert. He wasn't sure what it was, but it piqued his curiosity. It could be Dusty, but it could also be something else, something or someone moving in the wilds. Jack wasn't the type to ignore signs, so he nudged his horse forward, steering it toward the source of the noise. As he approached a small cluster of trees, Jack's instincts told him to slow down. The desert was full of hidden dangers, and he wasn't foolish enough to charge into unfamiliar territory without caution. The rustling grew louder now, a soft, almost haunting sound as if something was moving through the dry leaves on the ground. Jack's heart rate quickened as he steered his horse into the cover of the trees. His hand rested on the revolver at his side just in case. He knew that in these parts anything could be lurking. Wild animals, outlaws, or even other travelers. And with the way things had been changing in the West, Jack wasn't sure who or what he could trust anymore. Still, he pressed on, the sound leading him deeper into the thicket. It wasn't long before he noticed something strange, a trail not of hooves but of footprints. They were small, too small to belong to any man. Jack dismounted, tying his horse to a nearby branch. Following the trail carefully, Jack moved deeper into the forest. The rustling grew louder still, but now it wasn't just one sound. There were others, voices, low, quiet voices, almost as if someone was whispering in the trees. Jack's hand went to his revolver once more, and his eyes scanned the shadows. His breath was shallow, his senses alert. He was no fool. There were people nearby, and they weren't hiding for no reason. As he crept forward, Jack's thoughts raced. Could it be someone in trouble? Or worse, could they be up to no good? His instincts told him that whatever was happening in these woods wasn't right. It didn't take long before he reached a clearing, and there, hanging from a low-hanging tree, was something that made his blood run cold. 3 women, their bodies swaying gently in the breeze, their faces battered and bruised. They were tied to the tree, their limbs bound tightly with rough rope. Jack's heart stopped as he took in the sight. His first thought was that they were alive, maybe just unconscious. But as he stepped closer, he saw the truth. Their bodies were limp and motionless. There was no sign of life. Jack felt a rush of anger and confusion. Who could do such a thing? What kind of men would tie women to a tree and leave them to die like this? The scene before him was beyond words, beyond anything he had ever seen. His mind struggled to understand it. Apache women, From the way they were dressed and the long dark hair that fell around their shoulders were usually known to be strong and resilient. What had happened here was not just an attack, it was an execution. The silence of the moment weighed heavy on Jack's chest. He wanted to look away, to forget what he had seen, but he couldn't. The image of the three women, their broken bodies swaying in the wind, was burned into his mind. He had no idea who had done this, but one thing was clear. Whoever was responsible was still out there, and Jack was going to find them. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no time to waste. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was already working. Whoever had done this would pay. No one deserved to die like this. Not even women who might have been enemies of men. Everyone deserved respect, even in a land as wild and unforgiving as this one. Jack Turner was a man of few words, but when it came to justice, he had no hesitation. He turned his back to the women, but not to their memory. With one final glance over his shoulder, Jack made a vow. He would track down whoever had done this and make them pay for their cruelty. The hunt had just begun. The sun had now dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land. The stillness of the desert was almost oppressive, and Jack Turner couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The three Apache women hung from the tree like a dreadful reminder of the world's cruelty. The sight of their lifeless bodies left Jack with an unsettling feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. He stood there for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the women, each of them bearing the marks of a terrible fate. They had been strong, proud people, their lives tied to the land and the traditions of their people. Jack knew little of their culture, but he had seen enough to understand that their connection to the earth was deep, sacred even. To see them like this, hanging from the tree, was a terrible insult. Not just to the women, but to everything they had stood for. Jack shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He couldn't allow himself to be overwhelmed by anger or grief. He had a job to do, and time was wasting. He had to find out who was responsible for this act and bring them to justice. There was no room for hesitation. He had been in this situation before, facing down dangers that seemed insurmountable, and he had always managed to survive. This time, however, felt different. There was a darkness in the air that was hard to ignore. With a final glance at the women, Jack turned away, walking back toward his horse. The wind had picked up, causing the dry grass to whisper around his boots. As he mounted Dusty, he knew he couldn't simply ride away and forget what he had seen. This wasn't just some random act of violence. This was a message. The thought gnawed at him, and he felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. The only way to understand what had happened was to follow the trail, to find the men who had done this. He glanced at the ground, looking for signs, anything that could lead him to the perpetrators. A few yards away, he spotted something. Faint marks in the dirt, the imprints of boots. The tracks weren't fresh, but they were still visible enough for Jack to follow. He urged Dusty forward, keeping his eyes on the trail as it wound through the dense brush. The trees around him grew thicker, their branches reaching out like fingers, almost as if they were trying to warn him. The further he rode, the quieter the world seemed to become. Even the wind had died down. There was no bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath. Jack's mind kept returning to the women, their lifeless bodies hanging in the tree. Who could have done such a thing, and why? The Apache people were known to live in harmony with the land, not to create enemies. Yet there had always been tension between settlers and the native tribes, a tension that was growing in recent years as more settlers pushed further into the wilderness. But Jack had never been one to judge an entire group of people based on the actions of a few. He had always believed that every man, woman, and child deserved respect, regardless of their background. As he followed the tracks deeper into the woods, Jack began to notice other signs: broken branches, disturbed dirt, and the faint smell of smoke. The trail was growing fresher. The men were close. He urged Dusty forward, his thoughts focused on what he might find. The idea of confronting these men filled him with a mix of determination and dread. He wasn't sure how many there were or what kind of fight he might be walking into, but Jack wasn't the kind of man to back down from a challenge. The Apache women had suffered enough. It was time for their killers to answer for their actions. The trail led Jack to a small clearing where a faint column of smoke curled up into the sky. His heart began to race. There in the distance he saw a campfire. At first it seemed like any other camp, a simple fire surrounded by scattered belongings. But as Jack drew closer, he noticed the figures sitting around the fire. Men, rough and unkempt, talking and laughing. It was them. The killers. Jack's blood ran cold, but he didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He dismounted and tied Dusty to a nearby tree, making sure the horse was well hidden. Slowly, he crept toward the camp, careful to stay out of sight. The men didn't notice him at first, too caught up in their conversation. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying on the wind, loud and brash. Jack had heard enough to know that they were the same men responsible for what had happened to the women. There was no doubt in his mind. He took a deep breath and crouched low behind a rock, watching them closely. There were 5 of them in total, all armed with rifles and knives. They had the look of men who didn't care about the consequences of their actions. Jack's grip tightened on the hilt of his revolver. He had faced dangerous men before, but these men seemed different. They weren't just criminals. They were cold-hearted, capable of terrible things without a second thought. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't just walk up and confront them. It would be suicide. He needed a plan, a way to catch them off guard. He thought back to the clearing where he had found the women, the way the wind had whispered through the trees. It was a sound he could use to his advantage. The wind was strong in the desert, and it could carry a sound for miles if used correctly. Jack waited patiently, watching the men as they continued to talk. They didn't seem to be in any rush. Jack knew that would work in his favor. Slowly, he crept to the edge of the camp, keeping himself hidden behind the brush. The wind was picking up, and Jack knew this was his chance. He lifted his rifle and aimed it into the air. With one quick motion, he fired a shot. The loud crack of the gun echoed through the trees, sending the men scrambling to their feet. They looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the shot. Jack used their confusion to his advantage. He moved quickly, silently, staying in the shadows as he circled around them. They were on edge, their eyes darting in every direction, but they couldn't see him. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his focus. He would get them. They would pay for what they had done to the Apache women. The air was thick with tension, and Jack Turner's heart beat loudly in his chest as he moved like a shadow through the trees. The men who had murdered the Apache women were close now. He had fired the shot deliberately, knowing it would confuse them, and it worked. The 5 men were scattered, their eyes scanning the area in search of their unknown assailant. Jack had always been a patient man, and he knew he had to wait for the right moment. The sun was now low in the sky, casting long, stretching shadows across the desert. The fading light created an eerie glow in the clearing, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. Jack crouched behind a thick bush, watching as the men tried to gather themselves. They were nervous, that much was clear. They didn't know if they were being hunted or if the shot had come from another group of men. But Jack wasn't about to let them get away. He took a slow, steady breath and moved to the side, keeping himself concealed in the darkness. His mind raced with thoughts of the women he had found earlier that day. Their broken, lifeless bodies haunted him, and the image of their suffering pushed him forward. These men had caused that suffering, and they needed to face the consequences. Jack's plan was simple: isolate them, take them one by one. He had learned to track men like this for years, and he knew that fear and confusion were powerful tools. The men were already on edge, and Jack intended to use that to his advantage. He moved silently, his boots barely making a sound on the soft earth beneath him. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, and his revolver was at his side. He could feel the weight of it, knowing that at any moment he would need to use it. His mind was sharp, and his every movement was calculated. There was no room for mistakes. The men were still searching the trees, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. Jack spotted one of them, a tall man with a scar on his cheek, standing by the fire. He was too close to the others, but Jack could hear his voice, the low muttering as he tried to calm his companions. Jack's eyes narrowed as he studied the man. He didn't have time to waste. One by one, the others would have to be dealt with. Taking a deep breath, Jack decided it was time to make his move. He circled the camp quietly, staying low to the ground, and as he approached the back of the man with the scar, he saw his opportunity. He moved quickly, positioning himself just behind the man who was still unaware of Jack's presence. With a swift motion, Jack grabbed the man's arm and spun him around, covering his mouth with his hand to keep him from shouting. The man struggled, but Jack's grip was firm. "You're not going anywhere," Jack whispered in the man's ear. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the anger beneath it. The man's eyes went wide with shock, and he tried to break free, but Jack tightened his hold. He didn't want to kill this man, at least not yet, but he needed to subdue him without making noise. Slowly, Jack drew his revolver and held it to the man's back. "You're not the only one hunting today," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "Tell your friends to stay where they are, or this'll end real quick." The man didn't speak at first, but Jack could feel him trembling beneath his grip. Jack pressed the gun into his back, and the man finally nodded. All right, he whispered, his voice shaky. "I'll tell him." "Don't shoot me." Jack knew he had them now. He had isolated one of them, and the rest would be easy to deal with. With one last glance at the other men, Jack tugged the man by the arm, pulling him away from the fire and deeper into the shadows. The men had no idea where their companion had gone, and Jack wasn't about to give them a chance to find out. When they were far enough from the camp, Jack spoke again. "You're going to tell me what I want to know," he said firmly. "Who gave the orders? Who decided to kill those women?" The man was still breathing heavily, clearly frightened. We were just following orders," he stammered. "We didn't mean to kill anyone. It was the ranchers. They told us to send a message." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Ranchers, this wasn't just a random attack. This was something bigger. The thought of ranchers ordering the death of innocent women made Jack's blood boil. The land was harsh enough without people turning on each other, without this kind of cruelty and hatred. But Jack couldn't afford to lose focus now. He needed answers. "You're going to tell me exactly where they are," Jack said, his voice cold. "The men who gave the orders. I'm going to make sure they answer for what they've done." The man swallowed hard. He knew what Jack was capable of, and it was clear from his eyes that he didn't want to see any more bloodshed. "The ranchers, they're camped out by the river. It's not far from here. But please don't hurt me." Jack didn't respond. Instead, he simply grabbed the man's arm and pulled him forward. The hunt was not over. They had to finish this. As they made their way toward the river, Jack kept his focus. He knew that the ranchers would be well armed and ready for a fight. But Jack wasn't afraid. He had spent too many years surviving in the wilderness to be intimidated by a group of men who thought they could control the land with violence and fear. The river was just ahead, its waters shimmering in the fading light of day. Jack's mind was sharp, and he could hear the faint sounds of voices in the distance. The ranchers were close. His pulse quickened, but he remained calm. He had already come this far, and there was no turning back now. "Stay quiet," Jack whispered to the man, his grip on the revolver tightening. The man nodded, fear written all over his face. Jack had no time to feel sorry for him. He had given the man a chance to surrender, to help end the violence. Now, it was time for Jack to make sure that the killers would never hurt anyone again. The river was close enough now that Jack could hear the sound of water rushing over rocks. There were several small campfires glowing in the distance, and Jack could make out the figures of men gathered around the flames. This was it. The end of the hunt was in sight. Jack's plan was simple. He would take them by surprise, using the cover of the river's noise to his advantage. The first man who saw him wouldn't be the last. He could already picture the ranchers' shocked faces as they realized who had come for them. They would know, too late, that there was no escaping the justice they had earned. With one final glance at the man beside him, Jack made his move. The hunt for the killers was almost over, but the hardest part was still to come. The air was thick with tension as Jack Turner crouched low on the edge of the riverbank. The sound of the rushing water masked his movements, and his eyes remained fixed on the camp ahead. There around the fire were the men he had been tracking. The ranchers, the ones responsible for the brutal killings of the Apache women. Jack had come a long way, and now there was no turning back. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The campfires flickered, casting an orange glow over the faces of the men gathered around. There were 6 of them, all sitting in a circle, their rifles resting against nearby rocks, their voices low. They were relaxed, unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. They thought they were safe. They thought they were untouchable. But Jack knew better. He had been tracking them for hours, watching their every move, and now it was his turn to take control. Jack's mind raced as he planned his next move. He had one advantage, the cover of the river's noise. The men wouldn't hear him approach until it was too late. His heart beat steadily in his chest, but his mind was sharp, focused. He had seen many confrontations in his time, but this one felt different. These men weren't just outlaws. They were cold-hearted criminals who had decided that life meant nothing to them. They had taken the lives of innocent women without a second thought, and now they were going to pay for it. Jack turned to the man who had led him here, the one who had told him about the rancher's camp. He could see the fear still etched in the man's eyes, but there was no turning back now. The ranchers had made their choices, and Jack was going to make sure they faced the consequences. "Stay low and stay quiet," Jack whispered to the man, his voice calm but firm. "You're not to make a sound unless I say so." The man nodded, his eyes wide with fear. Jack couldn't blame him. This was dangerous work, but it was the only way to stop the violence that had been spreading through the land. Jack turned back to the camp, studying the men carefully. They were armed, yes, but they were also too relaxed. They didn't expect any trouble. They thought they could carry on their lives without consequences. But they were wrong. Jack moved silently, his boots barely making a sound on the soft earth. The river provided perfect cover as he crept along the bank, drawing closer to the camp. The men were still unaware, too caught up in their conversation to notice the approaching danger. Jack kept his revolver close, ready for anything. His eyes flicked from one man to the next, picking out the one who seemed to be in charge and the one whose voice carried the most weight. That man, a tall figure with a wide-brimmed hat, was sitting on a log, his hands resting on his knees. He had a rifle leaning against his leg, and he was talking animatedly with one of the other men. Jack didn't hesitate. He knew this man would be the key to breaking the group. If he could take the leader out first, the rest would fall apart. With that thought in mind, Jack slowly moved closer, staying low and out of sight. His heart beat faster now, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He was close, so close he could almost reach out and touch the man. The other men were distracted, their backs turned as they spoke amongst themselves. Jack took one last breath, steadying his nerves, and then he made his move. In a swift motion, Jack stepped from behind a cluster of trees, raising his revolver. His voice rang out, sharp and steady, carrying over the river's rush. "Drop your guns," Jack commanded. The men froze. For a moment, there was complete silence. The sound of the river seemed to grow louder in the stillness, and Jack could hear the men's breathing quicken. The man in charge, the one Jack had been watching, slowly turned toward him, his hand inching toward his rifle. But Jack was faster. He aimed his revolver directly at the leader, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "I said drop your guns," Jack repeated, his voice colder this time. He wasn't playing games. These men had taken lives, and now they were going to pay. The leader hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the others, but he saw the determination in Jack's eyes and knew he had no choice. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his rifle and set it down on the ground. The other men followed suit, their faces tight with fear. Jack could see the realization settling in. They had been caught. "Good," Jack said, his voice low. "Now I want to know why. Why did you kill those women? What were you hoping to prove?" The leader sneered, though there was no real bravado behind it. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rough. "This is our land now. We're just doing what we have to do." Jack's jaw clenched. He had heard enough. These men weren't just ranchers protecting their land. They were bullies using violence to impose their will. The Apache women had been nothing more than a symbol of what they hated, and they had decided to act on their hatred without a second thought. "I don't care about your excuses," Jack said, his voice cold. "What you did was wrong, and now you're going to answer for it." The men shifted uneasily, but Jack's gaze remained steady. He knew they wouldn't try anything while he was holding his gun on them, but he also knew that it was time to end this. He had the power now. He had control over the situation, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. "We're not here to start trouble," Jack continued. "But you've crossed the line. The women you killed were innocent, and now you're going to face justice." The leader scoffed, clearly unwilling to accept responsibility. "Justice? You're just a cowboy. What do you think you can do?" Jack's eyes hardened. "I can do enough." Without another word, Jack turned his attention to the other men. They were still standing there, unsure of what to do, but Jack wasn't finished yet. He needed to make sure they understood the gravity of their actions. The law might not be here to deliver justice, but Jack was. "You're lucky," Jack said, his tone dangerous now. "Because I'm giving you a chance. You can walk away, but you'll never get to forget what you did. You'll never forget the women you murdered. That's something you'll have to live with for the rest of your lives." For a moment it seemed as though the men might try something foolish, but the look in Jack's eyes stopped them. They were defeated, their bravado shattered. Jack had taken their power from them and they knew it. Slowly, one by one, they dropped to their knees, their heads bowed in defeat. Jack stood over them, his revolver still raised, but his mind was already focused on the next steps. He had done what he had set out to do. He had confronted the men who had caused so much pain. Now he would ensure they would never harm anyone again. "You'll leave this land," Jack said, his voice firm, "and you'll never return. If you do, the consequences will be worse than you can imagine." The men nodded, too broken to argue. They had been shown the consequences of their actions, and they knew they had no choice but to leave. Jack turned and began to walk away, his heart still heavy with the memory of the Apache women, but a sense of justice settling over him. He had done what needed to be done, and though he couldn't bring the women back, he had ensured that their deaths had not been in vain. The wind whispered through the trees as Jack Turner made his way back toward the clearing where the 3 Apache women had been found. The evening was quiet now, the sun having set behind the hills, casting a cool darkness over the land. The men he had confronted earlier, the ranchers responsible for the brutal act, were gone, sent away with a warning they would never forget. But Jack knew that true justice wasn't always served in the way most people expected. There were no trials, no judges, just the weight of what had been done and the consequences of facing the wrong kind of justice. As he walked, the weight of the day settled on him. He wasn't sure if he would ever feel at peace with what had happened. The murder of those women had haunted him since he first discovered them hanging from the tree. No matter how hard he tried to move past it, the image of their lifeless faces remained burned into his memory. He had come to this land looking for a lost horse, but what he had found instead was a reminder of the brutal realities of life in the frontier. Jack's boots crunched lightly against the dry leaves and fallen branches as he entered the clearing. It was quiet now, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind through the leaves and the faint chirping of crickets in the distance. The tree where the women had been hung still stood tall, its branches reaching toward the darkening sky like fingers grasping at the air. The marks of the women's suffering were gone, but Jack knew they would never truly leave. The land would remember what had happened here. He stood for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the tree. He had done what he could. He had confronted the ranchers, made sure they understood the consequences of their actions, and sent them away. They would not return. But as he looked at the tree, Jack realized that justice in the way he had hoped for wasn't something he could fully bring. He had fought for it, but there was something deeper that would forever be beyond his reach. The wind picked up again, swirling around him, carrying with it the smell of pine and earth. Jack's thoughts drifted to the Apache women. He wondered who they had been, what their lives had been like before they met such a cruel end. What dreams had they held? What hopes had they nurtured for their families and communities? Jack knew little of their culture, but he had seen enough to understand that the Apache had a deep connection to the land, a bond that ran through generations. He had no right to claim to understand it, but he could respect it and, in his own way, honor it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bundle of sage, a gift he had taken from the land. It was a tradition he had seen practiced by others in the region, one that symbolized a deep respect for the earth and the spirits who dwelled within it. Jack didn't claim to understand the full significance of the ritual, but he had learned enough to know that it was a way of offering thanks to the land and the spirits for their guidance and protection. It felt right to do this now in this place for the 3 women who had been lost. Kneeling beside the tree, Jack placed the bundle of sage on the ground and lit it with a match. The smoke rose slowly into the air, curling upward like a prayer. He sat back on his heels, watching the smoke dance in the breeze, and for the first time in hours, Jack felt a sense of peace. It wasn't complete, but it was something. "May your spirits find peace," Jack said softly, the words more for himself than for anyone else, "and may the land never forget what happened here." The fire from the sage flickered in the breeze, and Jack sat in silence, allowing the moment to wash over him. The world around him seemed to hold its breath as though waiting for something to change, but nothing moved. The land was still, and in that stillness, Jack realized something he hadn't before. There was no easy answer to what had happened. There was no simple justice that could undo the suffering. There was only the memory of those lost lives, the memory of the women who had been hanged and left to die, and the knowledge that Jack had done what he could to bring their killers to account. His time in the desert was far from over. There were still other battles to fight, other injustices to confront. Jack knew that, but for now, in this moment, the haunting image of the women would stay with him. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could carry their memory with him, and he could carry on the fight for justice, for respect, for peace. After a few moments, Jack stood up, the breeze ruffling his shirt and touzling his hair. The sky had grown darker and the first stars began to twinkle faintly in the heavens. He took one last look at the tree, the place where the women had been left to die. It would be a memory that would follow him for the rest of his days, a weight he would carry with him as long as he walked the earth. Jack turned away and began to walk back toward his horse. The journey back to the ranch would be long, but it was something he had to do. There were still questions to answer, still people to speak with. But the memory of the 3 Apache women and the justice he had served on their behalf would remain with him always. In some way, it would guide him forward. As he rode off into the night, the sounds of the desert around him seemed to settle into a quiet rhythm. The wind had calmed and the air felt cooler now. The world felt different than it had before. The sun would rise again tomorrow, but for tonight Jack felt a small sense of closure. The wrongs that had been done could not be undone, but they had been faced, and the weight of them was a little easier to carry. He could only hope that the spirits of the women who had died here would find peace. And perhaps in some small way Jack Turner would find it too.